Theology is there. Then he shows how in the relationships, and I want to show you this figure, in the relationships of the Great Pyramid, as we increase it fourfold, representing the square, we also obtain a circle. So there's some sacred geometric principles. The measurements of the areas and the proportions of the triangles, the squares, and the circles, based on the Great Pyramid and upon the flap on the apron, can be equated, and he shows how. I'm not going to worry about showing you how exactly at this point in time, but it can be related to the great name Yahweh, the tetragrammaton, the 4 letters of the great God. And of course then you have the Pythagorean triangle based on the mathematics and geometry of Pythagoras. And then he discusses the relationships of the Great Pyramid of Giza, the base of the square and the vertical axis of the triangle form an inverted Tao cross in the proportions of 16 to 10. Don't worry about the, you can see the triangle here. The base of the triangle equals one side of the square. And then the vertical, you can see the 2 triangles in the pyramid, and the vertical, the relationship of the areas correspond very well with the square, which has a 16 to 10 ratio. And then he ties that in with the Jehovah, Yahweh. Then he talks about the lateral side of the Great Pyramid and the vertical side of the Great Pyramid, the triangles and their relationships in proportions. And this ties in with the apron found in one of the Pharaoh's tombs of the Pharaoh that the Pharaoh used to wear, the triangular apron there, and he shows the relationships of the triangles with the triangles on the aprons of the great pharaohs. Oh, and then he shows from a top view, this is the Great Pyramid. There's the peak there looking down, and you can see that same triangle with the vertical rise, the slope, and the base, how it ties in with the square. So from the point of view of a bird's eye view, you have the relationship of the Pythagorean triangle with a square, and it matches what our apron looks like symbolically in Freemasonry. And I think that's interesting. Every component, geometric proportion of the apron is representative or symbolic of the deity or of some divine essence. The idea of the apron in Freemasonry is that it is founded on God, it lives in God, and tends to lead all men to God. The apron is Masonry's preeminent emblem, because it is representative and symbolic of the supreme architect of the universe. He says that on page 341. This gives us interesting implications. I want to show you something else I've discovered about the pyramid, the apron in Masonry, that I think is quite fascinating. And I found this in The Builder, the magazine The Builder, by Brother H.A. Kingsbury. It's from March 1917. He shows the geometric shape of the apron, and he's talking about the antiquity of the priests of Mithras and the Scandinavian rites, the candidate receives a shield, which is an apron, and so on and so forth. White being the symbol of purity and innocence and all that. But he says, let's look at the geometry of the apron. Let's take a look at this. Isn't that fascinating? The apron with the flap up, if you turn it into a three-dimensional object, it's a cube with a pyramid on top of it. It brings in the numbers 3, 4, 7, 1, the point of the pyramid, the very apex, the beginning of a point. And then, of course, you have the point within the circle, as Brother Stolte showed, the proportions of the base of the triangle being one side of the square, and then connecting it with the circle, with the point in the center of the circle, that is the apex of the pyramid. All of this in the apron. Makes you think, doesn't it? Do we have a cosmological dimension to Freemasonry that very few of us think about, and because of that we've lost the meaning of it? I'm just exploring ideas with you. Things that make you go, And you know what's so interesting is, what got me started on all of this was S. Brent Morris's really fun book to read, The Folger Manuscript, The Cryptanalysis and Interpretation of an American Masonic Manuscript. His idea, his interpretation and his decryptographing this manuscript was absolutely beautiful. It's a great read. If you haven't read it, you ought to. But I saw this figure, and I thought, gosh, I wonder why that figure is in the Folger manuscript. Take a look at this figure and tell me what you think. There's one page of the Folger manuscript. This is in its cryptograph form, which S. Brent Morris has deciphered. It's basically about the 3 degrees of Freemasonry. But look at that. One side, if you look at one side of that figure straight on, there's our apron. But that's what it could look like in 3D form. A pyramid on top of a cube. Now, the Folger manuscript dates way back to the early 1800s. Folger, of course, was involved in the Scottish Rite in America in the early 1800s, and then he lived, of course, all the way through the 1800s. Albert Pike didn't like Folger or Cerneau at all. Folger sided with Cerneau, but that very interesting figure about the apron is really fun to ponder, isn't it? And of course, Arturo de Hoyos, in his notes in Albert Pike's Esoterica, really sensational read. Pike analyzed this symbolism of the Masonic apron as well. It represented a myriad of exalted ideas to him. For example, the triangle and the square are the mystical number 7, signifying the 7 ancient planets, the colors of the rainbows. The triangle also alludes to various divine triads, while the square represents the material nature, or the triangle represents God and the square humanity. He further equates the triangle and the square with the Masonic cubical stone. Now this is interesting. We do have that cubical stone, a cube surmounted by a 4-sided triangular pyramid, which signifies the unity of nature and God. So this is interesting, that when we don that Masonic apron, we may be putting on more than we think we are. Kevin Townley has written a couple of books on the cube of space that I want to discuss with you. He wrote this book in 1993. Now, the Sefer Yetzirah, the book of formation, the book of creation, is a very mystical text. What it ultimately teaches from the Jewish mystical side of things is that the universe is a cube. It begins with a point, stretches to a line, and then it stretches out in various directions into the form of a cube. And this is the cube of creation, the container of all that is. It is a demarcation of sacred space, getting rid of chaos through order. It's very interesting. Here's one of the figures of the cube. Notice how beautifully the Solomon seal fits onto a cube. This is the altar. The Holy of Holies in Solomon's temple, which we ideally as Freemasons tie our lodges to, not in a historical sense, in a spiritual, religious heritage, in a legendary theme with the cube of space, because the temples, of course, were earthly prototypes of heaven itself. Models of the universe, models of the cosmos, is what our lodges represent. And the cube is the altar and the Holy of Holies, and it's described as such in the Old Testament.